morning, everyone. I'm City Council Member Richie Torres. I'm the chair of the New York City Council Committee on Oversight and Investigations, and I'm proud to be joined by the Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams. The two of us have come together to call on the New York City Department of Investigations to investigate allegations of a work slowdown in the New York City Police Department. Here in New York City, we have seen a shocking outbreak of violence, especially gun violence. Not only retaliatory violence between and among gangs, but also random violence, striking at civilians. The most tragic case is the one-year-old baby that was struck by a stray bullet. Teenagers struck by a stray bullet. We've seen the loss of innocence in a city that is failing increasingly to protect its own residents. Now, historically, we do see a surge in shootings during the summer. But in 2020, we saw nearly a doubling of the surge in summertime shootings. In the latest summer, among shooting incidents, we saw an 87% increase from 510 incidents to 955 incidents. We saw a 95% increase in shooting victims from 602 to 1,174. There is a perception among members of the general public, as well as elected officials, that the rising violence is largely driven by a work slowdown. But the reality matters more than the perception. The NYPD is making fewer gun arrests, is solving fewer gun cases, is responding more slowly to gun crimes in progress. When it comes to gun arrests, according to the New York Times, from late June to mid-July, the number of gun arrests fell by 67%. When it comes to gun cases, according to the New York Times, from January to mid-July, the clearance rate fell from 30% to 23%. And when it comes to response times, according to New York One, response times in June rose by 44%, and in July and August rose by 14%. Fewer guns arrested, fewer gun cases solved, slower response times. These are signs of a possible work slowdown. You know, Occam's razor holds that the simplest explanation is almost always the best. And the dramatic increase in gun violence can be best explained by the dramatic decrease in gun enforcement. Now, none of us know the truth with absolute certainty, and so that's why we are calling for an investigation to examine whether there is, in fact, a work slowdown, and to what extent has the work slowdown driven the growth in violence in New York City. Right? If the mayor and the police department are committed to finding the truth, then there is nothing to fear from an independent investigation. Now, Mayor de Blasio and the NYPD and the PBA have said that the rise in violence can be largely attributed to everyone but them. It's the faults of the pandemic and the protesters. It's the faults of the politicians and the prosecutors. It is the fault of everything and everyone except the very mayor, the very police department, the very police union whose job is to prevent violence. Right? That argument represents excuse-making. And what New Yorkers need and deserve is not excuse-making, but greater accountability. You know, there are those who advocate for aggressive over-policing. And then there are those who advocate for the abolition of policing. But what most New Yorkers want is neither over-policing nor under-policing. What most New Yorkers want and deserve is proper policing. And we recognize that proper policing is hard work. It's always a work in progress. But as a city, we have to be honest. When we fail to achieve proper policing, and as a city, we are falling short. And communities of color in places like Brooklyn and the Bronx are paying the heaviest price. The public has a right to demand both public safety and greater accountability in policing. The public has a right to expect the police to protect them from violence, but it also has a right to expect that officers who abuse their power are to be held accountable. There is no contradiction between public safety and greater accountability in policing. The public deserves both, and we demand both. So with that said, Mr. Borough President.
Thank you. Thank you. I really want to thank Councilman Torres for hearing the call and using the weight of his committee to look into something that is extremely dear to me. As a former police officer, there were many years in law enforcement where I did not like the policies that were put in place. But every day that I put on that uniform, I didn't take out my frustration on politicians to not protect the public. And when you look at these numbers, they do not lie. There's a clear decrease in arrests, a 39% decrease. There is an increase in response time. When you look at the months that we indicated, June, July, and August, there are real issues that we are asking the police commissioner to look into. This inquiry request started July 14th. I sent a letter to the police commissioner, and I asked him to have the integrity control officers of every precinct to do an analysis using the 911 system to determine were there some officers who were intentionally slowly moving towards jobs. Why did this question come? First, I received calls from citizens who stated that officers were not responding to jobs or taking an increasingly amount of time to get there. Then I started receiving calls from police officers who stated that they are frustrated by some of their colleagues that have made the decision that they're not going to respond to jobs at the appropriate time. When a police officer does a slowdown, he's not only endangering the public, but he's also endangering the lives of his colleagues. And so what needs to be looked at, the Department of Investigation must look at precinct by precinct to see if job actions are taking place in certain precincts out of frustration. They must analyze the numbers per officer. Every police officer has an activity sheet that can show the numbers starting in June, looking and doing a comparison to July and August. All of this information is readily available. I heard the mayor say when people state that there's a potential slowdown, that it makes his blood boil. Mayor, it makes my blood boil when a 1-year-old child is shot. It makes my blood boil when a 68-year-old woman is sitting on her stoop getting air and she's the victim of a shooting. It makes my blood boil when 101 people are shot during the month of July. That is what makes my blood boil. Going to funerals after funerals, seeing the numbers of shootings that if you were to do a heat map, you'll see the shootings are overlaying the communities that had heavy-handed policing, that were hit hardest by COVID-19, that received a lack of resources, that also had to deal with historical violence. That is what's making my blood boil. That is why we need a real answer. And to anyone that states this is anti-policing to require those officers that are doing a slowdown to do their jobs, they don't know what proper policing is. This is pro-policing, because those officers who called me and came to me, they clearly stated they would have rather went internally to report what they witnessed, but didn't have the confidence. We must not only rebuild the confidence back in the city between civilians and police, we must rebuild the confidence within the police department that our officers know that they can report misdoings by other officers and won't be retaliated against. That's why this investigation is important. It is our obligation as elected officials to ensure that the calls from civilians and police are both answered and come to the truth. A proper investigation will give a clear outcome of what has taken place during these months of June, July, and August. Clear numbers that show there has been a slower response each month, and we need to know why. And I'm calling on the police commissioner and mayor to take immediate actions to rectify what we've witnessed. As of August 23rd, murder up 30%, shooting victims up 95%, shooting incidents up 87%, 9/11 times rose. Plain and simple, we're getting there late, crimes are going up, and we're getting to the jobs late. Every minute is a lifetime when you deal with crime. And we cannot allow the minutes to continue to tick up without immediately saying we must get there faster and have a more comprehensive approach to this incident. Thank you. And again, I want to thank Councilman Torres for his quick response to this important issue.
Actually, do you want to handle? Look, I find it interesting that the Public Safety Agency refuses to be held accountable for public safety outcomes. I'll take the overtime. There's no one in the world who thinks the cap on overtime is real, right? The Independent Budget Office projects that the so-called overtime cap is going to be exceeded by $400 million. So the notion that that is a constraint on the NYPD's ability to fight crime, again, is nothing more than baseless excuse-making. There were fewer gun arrests. There were fewer gun cases solved. There were slower response times to gun crimes in progress. And there's more gun violence. If you think the occurrence of all of those trends at the same time is purely coincidental, then you're deluding yourself. And it's time for the NYPD to take responsibility for its job.
And what else is important here is that, and I think this is being lost in the conversation as we're hearing some critique what we're raising today. Police officers have reached out, and that needs to be highlighted. This is not just the council person and Eric Adams. Police officers that took an oath are frustrated and angry by some of their colleagues in certain parts of the city not responding to jobs correctly. And some of the officers have raised that they don't believe this slow response is being done citywide. Certain areas it is taking place. And so an analysis of the data would tell us, are we having a certain slow response time in certain areas? And so to state, and this is really alarming to me, to state that because a policy is made in government, that the police are now saying we are unwilling and reluctant to do our job because of a policy change in government, and that is being used by the top end of management, that's unacceptable. They're stating everything from a disorderly group, person carrying a firearm, crimes in progress. We're not talking about nuisance or just noise complaint, even though there's a slower response on noise complaints, but crimes in progress, 911 calls being made. In some cases, officers have not shown up at all. So all of this information, because of the police 911 system, you can do an analysis immediately to find out if this is accurate or not. You could do a complete analysis. Our letter that went out July 12th, we have yet to get a response from. So this is not a challenging task to do. Every precinct has an integrity control officer. That integrity control officer can go in and do an analysis, look at the records of every police officer, see how long it took them to get to a job, and compare that from each month. And so there's no reason we don't have data readily available on this incident. How they respond. Right, they can find out. I don't know the exact neighborhoods. That's what we're calling for the police department to do an analysis based on precinct by precinct. From the reports I received, that there are certain precincts where you're seeing a greater slowdown in service than others, and an analysis can let us know that.
So look, we expect DOI to investigate whether. So here's how I view the situation. There's no question that there has been less gun enforcement in New York City. The question is the under-policing of gun violence driven by an intentional work slowdown? And that's the need for a DOI investigation. I intend to hold a hearing on all of the DOI's ongoing investigations into the NYPD during March. And so this will be one of the subjects that I raise at the hearing. I'm sorry, in October. I'm going to echo what the Borough President said. The politics should have no bearing on our obligation to the public. When you are an officer, you take an oath to defend and serve the public, regardless of politics, regardless of who's in office. Because when the NYPD fails, people die, lives are at stake. So we're arguing that the obligation to keep the public safe transcends politics. Now, obviously, I strongly disagree with the positions that the PBA has taken, such as endorsing Donald Trump. New York City is facing $9 billion worth of deficits over the next 2 years. We're in danger of laying off more than 20,000 employees. And the PBA has endorsed a president who is telling New York City to drop dead. Right? Nothing would be more destructive to the NYPD, nothing would be more destructive to the PBA than the fiscal collapse of New York City. And that's the reality that's staring us in the face.
I think it's important that, which I believe is really lost in the narrative right now, we want to rebuild trust between community and police and rebuild trust within the police department. Many officers of all ethnicities were concerned about the direction of policing in our country. And this is an opportunity to rebuild that trust. And adding the rhetoric of the president and the rhetoric that we're seeing by some union representatives, instead of rebuilding that trust, it is hurting that trust. And it's imperative that we allow those officers that want to serve and protect the public to do their job without interference. Too many officers have reached out to me and said, I don't want one-year-old babies shot and killed in the city under my watch. And they want their colleagues that have decided not to do their job to start doing their job. And if the top end of City Hall and the police department gives excuses to those officers that are not doing their job, it is going to cascade throughout the entire department, and we're going to lose those officers who want to serve and protect the city of New York. I'm sorry? We received a number of flyers and emails that were sent to us around the 4th of July week to tell people to have the blue flu. We don't know if that actually took place, so we're not sure. We're not sure if there was any unofficial communications through the multiple networks, through Facebook, through other technology that's used. But that should be part of the review of exactly what's taking place, to identify what's the source of those who are putting out these communications. Yes.
Should the anti-crime unit be brought back in some capacity to get a handle on the gun violence?
Yes, I've made this clear. Policing can't be predictive only. It must be predictive and unpredictable. And those are the tools. Anti-crime is one of the tools. It was abused, just like stop and frisk was abused. But to have the right officers assigned, the right partial uniform that they're readily identified by, to have the right supervision, it should be on a local level, not a citywide level. That was one of the problems. We did not disband the citywide level. We should disband the citywide level and have a precinct level. A smart anti-crime team could address some of the gun violence with precision policing. We know the shooters in the city. We know who are shooters. With having precision policing, with a smart remake of our anti-crime plainclothes units, and stopping the flow of guns in our city. We have too many guns that are coming up I-95. I take my hat off to DA Melinda Katz for what she did in going after a gun dealer. We need to start dealing with the source of these guns and not just dealing with after they're in our city. This is the standard penalties that's what you're talking about, correct? They standardize the penalties that someone. Right. For those who, I just want to be clear on what I'm answering. For those who are charged with abuse of authority or force, here are the penalties that they will be getting. That's very important, because if you during the days of 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement and Guardians, you often had an extremely subjective rule on if someone was accused of a penalty. There was a disproportionate number of officers of color who were given harsher penalties than their white counterparts. So having a clear matrix, it will take away the penalty being unfair. I think important to do so. I have not seen what the penalties are to say if I believe they're severe enough or not. I would like to look at those. They just released them, I believe, today. But standardizing to know if you're found guilty of a particular action, we should know your penalty, what it's going to be. I think it's important. I think that it goes back to what I stated. Right now, you have officers assigned to your precinct. You have commanding officers assigned to your precinct. You don't know their background. The new bill 50A allows us to go in and look at prior reports of abuse, if they were found guilty or not, And so this is imperative that we continue to move forward and get those penalties done. So I think it's a real win that we're able to do this now. It's very important to do so. Yes. No, I think CompStat is an important way to determine crime in real time. And so I am not a supporter of believing we should stop using CompStat as one of the programmers that started the first version of us in OLTPS. So I think that CompStat plays a major role, and if it's used correctly. Whatever tools we use, it should be used not to abuse, but it should be used to ensure that we identify crime patterns and make sure resources are put in those places to prevent it from taking place. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of the abuse of CompStat. You know, CompStat is a method of identifying real crime. Of my use of CompStat, it has been used effectively. I'm not sure what precincts actually abuse it. Okay?